Cyber JA is a place where we discuss all things cybersecurity and GRC. And guys, I'm really excited for all the fun that we'll be having in this session. So definitely stay tuned. Um, Ask all the necessary questions. Feel free to ask questions as we just have some fun going through this GRC exercise that we'll be looking at. So it's all about having fun as GRC professionals within the industry, being able to develop those necessary skills that are required by the various industries or organizations that definitely need our skill set as it relates to executing those various GRC activities. One of the things is that as GRC professionals within the industry, then you will be assigned many different projects or roles within an organization. And of such, you definitely must be flexible as possible to undertake these various assignments. I mean, whether it's to conduct an audit, gap analysis, or risk assessment, to develop a plan to implement or help an organization to meet a particular compliance requirement. The key is to understand the standard and its requirements to meet the desired compliance and the process involved for its implementation. That's the key thing as it relates to meeting the various compliance within organization, understanding the requirements of the standard, taking that time to drill down into the details, becoming very familiar. Once you understand the standards, then it's a matter of understanding the implementation process. So, as I mentioned, the key is understanding the standard and its requirements to meet the desired compliance and the process involved for its implementation. And then this is often followed by communicating the importance of implementing that standard. And for sure, getting the executives and the necessary stakeholder support with its implementation, and importantly, developing a plan for the implementation of that particular standard. So, in this particular session that I will be going through with you at this point in time, then this session will not be focused on the implementation of HIPAA, but rather the process of executing a very important aspect of its implementation. That's the key thing that we're looking at. So we're looking at and implementing the HIPAA can be a very complex and involved process, which goes beyond this 1 hour session that we're looking into. So if this is something that you want to be able to execute or help an organization, in particular the health industry, to meet such compliance regulation, then it definitely takes more than this particular session. You would have to take that time to dive into the necessary requirements of the HIPAA Act itself, become familiar with that Act and all of the necessary requirements and details of this Act and all that is required for an organization to be compliant with this Act. This is something that is very important. And the HIPAA compliance, now this for persons who might not be familiar, HIPAA actually stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, as you're seeing on screen. And we're looking at conducting this HIPAA electronic patient health information security risk assessment. So that's the thing that we will be focusing most of our attention on in this particular session itself. Now, let us first get an understanding of the background info as it relates to the HIPAA standard itself. And quickly on screen, guys, then you're seeing the checklist, right? So this is pretty much our checklist for the HIPAA compliance. And it consists of approximately 8 main items. So we have one of the first checklist items that you will come across is to thoroughly understand HIPAA's 3 rules. And I'll be bringing across those 3 rules, highlighting those rules, right? Then you want to discover which rules apply to your organization. Then you want to determine what data requires extra protection. Then determine what perform that risk analysis. Then establish accountability in your compliance plan, followed by avoid violations by addressing gaps. Then maintain detailed documentation and report security incidents immediately. So this is a checklist, a compliance checklist that can be used to guide the process. But all of this is quite involved. It goes beyond just working with a checklist. And that's very important when it comes down to HIPAA. One of the things is that implementing the HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is an essential step for any organization that handles protected health information, that's PHI. And HIPAA of itself provides a framework for safeguarding this PHI, which is the protected health information, and ensuring patients' privacy. So you have security combined with privacy. So with that checklist, then you definitely have to have that plan to execute this particular checklist. And that's where all of the work actually comes into being. So once you become familiar with the standard, you have this checklist as your guide, then you have to develop that comprehensive plan to implement this particular standard it's in of itself. And that is where you have to take that time to understand all the various elements that are associated with the HIPAA Act or standard in of itself. Now, so as it relates to just for us to get a understanding, I'll be basically jumping across a number of resources, and I'll also be placing a link in the my YouTube link with all the resources that I will be going through in this particular session. So, guys, as I said before, you will not be able to um, use this information as is to go in an organization to execute a compliance or to implement this standard in of itself. But this is just to create an awareness so you at least you're able to execute this particular risk assessment. So looking at this checklist, there are a number of tasks that are required to implement this particular standard within an organization. One of those key elements is performing that risk analysis. And that is what we are going to be focusing on in this particular session. Or it is that we perform this particular risk assessment, going through all the necessary phase. Um, we're going to be looking at setting up that environment and also the tool that can be used to execute this particular task. If it is that you are given this assignment as a GRC professional within an institution, within an organization, then at the end of this session, then you should be able to uh, highlight this on your resume as something that you are able to execute. So as soon as I go through this particular session, then you'll be exposed to the tool that I'll be using, the resources, and also for you to now take this information and to build on it, to practice, to experiment, to test the resource in of itself to become familiar with the standard. And this goes just about for any compliance regulations and standards. The key is, guys, to whether it's ISO 27001, whether it's NIST, is to become familiar with that standard as a GRC professional. That's the very first thing. Understand the standard that you are working with. Ensure that you know the details of the standards. Once you get that fully understood, then it's a matter of getting the support of the organization, understanding that plan, and being able to execute that plan, and being able to have everyone on board understanding what it is that you're trying to achieve as it relates to meeting that compliance regulations. So that's the key thing behind all of this. So let me quickly go over to, right, so there we have our checklist. Um, right, so before we actually go right into the actual task itself, I just want to give you a background understanding of all the necessary components that are involved in this HIPAA standard, this HIPAA compliance in of itself. So, okay, great. Right, and to joining us also in this discussion as we enjoy this particular session itself, we have Sajini, hope I'm pronouncing that name properly. So from time to time, you might be hearing Sajini asking various questions. So guys, feel free to, ask your questions as it go along. Do not hesitate to stop me as I go in this process of us having some of this particular risk assessment in of itself. All right, so there we have the guidance on risk analysis requirements under the HIPAA security rule. Right? So they actually produce an article in of itself that gives the guidance um, to execute this particular security risk assessment. And you're going to be seeing the importance of actually doing this assessment as we go along in this activity in of itself. All right, so the background to this, we're placing a link to all of these articles as I mentioned before. So this is the guidance, right? And the risk analysis requirements under the HIPAA security rule, right? So if we scroll along this document, this article itself, right? And if you might recognize, this article was actually published and posted in July 14. But the content of this article still remains relevant today in terms of its application in its implementation of the HIPAA standard, right? That's the key thing that you need to bear in mind. So in executing this risk analysis requirements, bearing in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, in this checklist, performing your security or a risk analysis. So this is pretty much a guideline that breaks out or gives you all of the details that are required to execute this particular risk assessment. Just like with any other um, compliance requirements, ISO 27001, you're also required to do these various risk assessment. Implementing your security program, a risk assessment is always required to understand where the vulnerabilities are in terms of the controls that are required to be implemented. And this is how you know where the gaps are in your system. This is how your gap analysis comes into being, to understanding where the gaps are, where you need to implement the necessary security controls or security measures to mitigate or minimize the impact of these risks on this organization. All right, so this is your guideline as it relates to that risk assessment. So it goes on to your risk analysis requirements under the security rule. All right, and let me just quickly bring this chart up quickly for you to better understand. So what we have is, right, so the relevant laws address three parts of HIPAA, right? So HIPAA actually deals with is broken down into your security rules, your privacy rules, and your breach notification rules. So those are the various areas that HIPAA actually addresses, right? Your security rules, the privacy rules, and the security rules look at regulations pertaining to protection of electronic patient health information. Then it is also broken down into the HIPAA privacy rule, which looks at regulations affecting resident patient rights and an organization responsibility to protect PHI. And also the HIPAA breach notification rule, which looks at regulations related to an organization responsibility to detect, assess, and mitigate breaches and to notify appropriate parties in a timely manner. Right? And as mentioned before, I will be pretty much just giving you that brief overview of all these various elements, moving parts. I mean, to really get a comprehensive understanding of implementing or executing all the various requirements, putting together your project plan will definitely go way beyond just a 1 hour or even just a 1 day session. It takes a number of moving parts, understanding all the various elements. But this is mainly just to give you an idea, so at least you're familiar with all of these elements as I'll be jumping from a number of different pieces, as the main focus of this is for you to get an understanding of what is actually done during that security risk assessment element of the compliance requirements for HIPAA standard. All right, so with that said, then we go back to the requirements. So the risk analysis requires requirements under the security rule, right? And it is broken down into important definitions. That's that section, right? This is the elements of a risk analysis, right? So we have to look at your the scope of the analysis. And as we go along into the application that I'll be showing you, as well as installing this application and setting up the application, then you will definitely be going through all of these elements, right? So the scope of the analysis, looking at your data collection, and it speaks to information about data collection, identifying and documenting potential threats and vulnerabilities, assess the current security measures. So these are all the details of that phase itself. Determining the likelihood of threat occurrence. And it also provides in the documentation itself all the details for determining the likelihood of threat occurrence. And it goes on to look at determining the potential impact of threat occurrence, right? So these are the rules in terms of what is required in terms of interpreting those rules. So all the necessary details are given inside this, right? Determine the level of risk, and then you have that final documentation. Now, all of this might seem somewhat overwhelming at first, and that is typical with almost anything that you're doing. All of this will seem very challenging, very difficult. You might be saying to yourself, how it is that I'm actually going to be going into an organization to assist. You might be saying, I do not have the experience. Um, how can I really execute such a task? But the fundamental thing, guys, as I mentioned earlier, you want to take that time to understand what it is that the organization is trying to achieve by implementing these compliance standards, regulation, act, whatever the case is. Try to take that time to understand all the moving elements, how it is that these things actually work together to support that organization. Once you become familiar with the standard, the requirements of the standard, then you are now in a better position to actually help that organization and to work with a team of individuals. And in most cases, if you are brand spanking new to the industry, I mean, no organization would actually ask you to do an entire project or a compliance project on your own. In most cases, required to be working as a part of a team of persons, right? And if you do not have the experience, then it is through sessions like this, then you want to tune in to at least get an insight into what is required. And for sure, if you continue to, I mean, follow the various resources, I have a lot of things in mind that I definitely want to share with the community in terms of garnering and building those, getting that practical hands-on experience that you can actually use. 'Cause one of the key things is in terms of building my practical experience, you want to get your hands on resources, tools that you can actually implement, and to say to employers that you actually know how to set up an environment, you understand the standards, what is required by the standards, how to actually develop a plan, how to work as part of a team to meet this regulation, and to be able to add these various things on your resume to say that I'm able to execute a risk assessment. I understand the requirements of the standard. I understand the challenges of actually implementing a particular standard. Because the fact is that you will implementing a compliance regulation, or meeting these compliance standards is not something, it's not a walk in the park. It requires a lot of work. You have to deal with various organizational challenges. At times, for example, if from an auditing perspective, you might need relevant information from persons in that organization to execute your duties. And unless you're able to communicate effectively, unless you're able to build those relationships, unless you're able to ask those meaningful questions to the relevant persons within the organization, then you're definitely going to have a lot of challenges along the way. So it goes beyond just being able to read the standards, but as I always say to persons, reach out on LinkedIn. And this is just additional information to what I'll be going into, right? Reach out to persons on LinkedIn, do a particular search. Search for persons who are actually in GRC, search for persons who are in auditing, for example, and to get a better understanding of their day-to-day operations for a particular standard that you want to execute or to become familiar with. All right. So now, with that said, once you understand this information in terms of the risk assessment document itself, right? Then you also have what is called the guidance on risk analysis, right? And they provide an outline. I think this is the same information here, right? This is the outline that they provide from this website itself. If you recognize, this is from the US Department of Health and Human Services, and they have all the necessary documentation on HIPAA in terms of HIPAA for individuals, HIPAA for professionals, guidelines, regulation, privacy, security. So all the necessary elements. So if you really want to get a lot of deep insights and knowledge about the HIPAA standard, the regulation, all the necessary elements, then this is a good resource to reference to actually get all that required detail and understanding about HIPAA in of itself. All right, so once that is done, guys, you understand your checklist, then the next element of this, and for sure you want to have that plan, right? So as I mentioned, the plan surrounding the HIPAA implementation, right? The first step in implementing the HIPAA is to hold an initial meeting with the key stakeholders in your organization. And this meeting should include, for example, representatives from each department that handles the various PHI, right? That's the health information within the organization, such as your IT, the human resources, and the healthcare providers in that organization. And the purpose of this is meeting is to discuss the importance of the HIPAA compliance, the scope of the project, and establish roles and responsibilities for each team member, right? So that's part of the planning process in terms of implementing this particular standard. And of course, conducting a risk assessment, and the list goes on, developing the policies and procedures, training employees, implementing the technical safeguards, etc. Right? So then let us now look at the actual tool itself that we want to configure, and to look at all the various parts of that tool as it relates to executing this activity of itself. 'Cause this is our main focus, performing that risk analysis, right? So let us go to the actual site itself that this tool, um, let me quickly refresh this page. Okay, great. So, right, so here we have this is what we call the security risk assessment tool, right? Right, so here we have our security risk assessment tool. And the security risk assessment tool, as it says that the Health Transportability and Accountability Act security rule requires the covered entities and its business associate conduct a risk assessment of their healthcare organization. Right? So this is a task that if you are actually a part of these organizations, then you could actually help in driving this initiative, right? By understanding this tool, how it is that this tool actually works in helping to execute this particular risk assessment. And it says that a risk assessment helps your organization ensure it is compliant with HIPAA administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. So those are the safeguards of the HIPAA standard that health organizations need to be compliant with, right? And a risk assessment also helps reveals areas where your organization's protected health information, which is PHI, could be at risk. And that's the key thing about this particular tool. And this SRA tool, and it says that the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology, in collaboration with the HHS Office for Civil Rights, OCR, developed a downloadable security risk assessment tool to help guide you through the process of executing this risk assessment. And the tool is designed to help healthcare providers conduct a risk assessment as required by HIPAA security rule and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Service Electronic Health Records Incentive Program. The target audience of this tool is medium and small providers. Thus, use of this tool may not be appropriate for large organizations. All right, so the first thing that you want to do is to download this particular tool, and this is an executable file that you can actually install on your environment, and it also comes along with an Excel workbook itself that is also similar to the tool. But for me, the tool is far much easier to work with, than the Excel. If you are more comfortable with Excel, then no problem. Right, so you have your Excel, you also have the user guide, right? So this is our user guide for that tool. I think this is the user guide, right? So it also comes with a user guide that goes into a lot of the details for using this particular security risk assessment tool in of itself, right? So there you have all the necessary details using the tool, starting a new assessment, saving assessment progress, and protect practice information, right? So all of the necessary details about conducting or using this particular tool is given inside this manual itself that you can use, right? So now that you are familiar with this, the background to the requirements, right? The manual for this risk assessment tool. One of the things I also want to bring to your attention, guys, is let me quickly just bring this across. Right, for persons who might not be familiar with the assessment requirements for HIPAA, I mean, this might be a little bit small for you to see. Nevertheless, let me see if I can just zoom this in a little bit. Okay, great. So these are the various HIPAA security rules and standards, right? This is how this is actually broken down, right? So when you decide to work with this organization, for example, you're actually implementing this um, standard within an organization. So these are different phases, right? You have your security standard, general rules, you have your administrative safeguards, physical safeguards, technical safeguards, and that is how it is broken down. So you'd actually sit in that organization, doing that assessment with the various departments to actually go through each of these phase necessary requirements and work with the various departments within the organization. In this case, the IT managers, the network administrators, developers, help desks, um, facilities managers, compliance officers, privacy officers, to actually implement all of the necessary requirements based on the standard, right? So these are the things that you would definitely get yourself familiar with as a GRC professional, if it is that you're working with the HIPAA compliant standard implementation, right? So over a period of time, then you would have become very versed at this, become very familiar with this. And there are also a number of other mechanisms, other platforms, GRC solutions that actually makes it a little bit far more easier than actually working with Excel documentation. But one of the things that when you understand the fundamentals, the background of all of this, even from an Excel perspective, then it makes your life even much more easier when you're working with all of those advanced, maybe AI designed automated applications, right? So having all of this information, then let us get right into the tool itself, right? So once you download and you install this particular tool, then this is what the tool actually looks like. All right, so that is your tool. So once you complete the installation of this tool, right, then you have two options. And in this case, you have continue with your security risk assessment or to start a new security risk assessment, right? So in our case, then we want to start a new security risk assessment, right? So the first thing that is required is for you to create a name. In this case, we could say test user, right? Test user, continue. And it says, I pick a spot to save your security risk assessment file, right? So in most organizations, might be working on a server. So you want to identify a location to save that particular file. And we can just say test, right? So once that is done, then we move on to the next phase, which is continue, right? And here we have our disclaimer, right? It's a very important information disclaimer that you definitely want to spend the time to read and to make note of this information, right? And it says that the security risk assessment tool at healthit.gov is provided for informational purposes only. Use of this tool is neither required by nor guarantees compliance with federal, state, or local laws, right? And the list goes on. So this is very useful information to make note of. So then you select continue. All right. All right. So this is what the tool actually looks like, right? Once it is installed, and it is broken down into three core steps. The very first one is to enter your practice information, whatever the medical institution, organization that you are working with, right? So you would have your SRA tool, which has three core steps. The first step is to enter your practice information, answer the assessment questions, then to review your final risk report. Because that is the thing that you want. You want to understand your risk posture as an organization. You want to know what your risks are. You want to know where the gaps are in the system, in your organization, so that you're able to implement the necessary controls, or better yet, you as the person that is leading that particular initiative is able to go to the executives or the stakeholder to say, look, these are the risks that I've identified to the organization that must be resolved. These are the risks, and these are the likelihood of these things happening. Um, and these are the necessary controls that need to be implemented in order to mitigate or to reduce the impact or likelihood of these risks affecting the organization, especially as it relates to the privacy of patients' information. And if you are following up with data breaches, then we know that patient or information or record um, in data breaches is very expensive in terms of a data breach. Each record, I believe, is approximately 150 US. I should, I believe, but I mean, you could always double check on that. But I believe it's approximately 150 US per record as it relates to a data breach, right? So when it comes on to the healthcare industry, then patient data, the privacy of patient data is very, very critical, very important. So organizations that are dealing with healthcare information definitely have to be compliant, have to have all the necessary controls and mechanisms in place to ensure that they are mitigating all the risk associated with the exposure of patient data, right? So you have to put in those safeguards to protect this, to secure the information as well as to protect the privacy of patients' information. So this is where the tool is broken down into these three steps. Step one, so let us go through this particular, and here you have it. It says that what is a risk security assessment, right? And the good thing about this tool, every phase, every step of the way, it provides detailed information. So if you are new to this process, you are able to learn as you go through the process, right? So a security risk analysis is the foundation upon which to build security activities to protect electronic protected health information, which is EPHI. And the SRA tool will help you identify and assess risks to EPHI in your organization so that you can implement appropriate safeguards. And when using this tool, it asks that please also review the SRA tool user guide and OCR guidance on risk analysis. And this is the information that um, I actually showed you prior to this, the implementation of this application itself. All right, so with that said, guys, let us then move on to the first. phase. So depending on the nature of your organization, the practice, then the next thing that you want to do, right, is to have the name of the practice, whatever the name of that particular healthcare organization, right? So we can actually say this is a test healthcare, right? We can actually just make up some information as we go along. Zip code, maybe XYZ, all right? Let us just make some information up. Point of contact, could say chief medical officer, make up an email address, could say test user at, right? And you can also add many other locations depending on the nature and the scope of the organization, right? You can have multiple practice information, right? And if you click on this, it provides a link to tell you what practice information is. So it says add your practice information. And this is right. So what is my practice information used for? And information entered in this screen will be displayed in the reports that become available after your security risk assessment is completed. And this helps associate the output of your SRA with your practice location. And this information is not collected by or transmitted to the United States Department of Health and Human. All right, so once we have all of those fields populated, then we move on to next. Oh, let me just re-input this information. I should have saved this before I actually selected next. So test address, we just make something up, city. All right, so there we have point of contact, medical officer, chief medical officer, phone, can also make numbers up, email, test at the hospital.com. Then we can say save this location. Okay, so immediately we have a problem there. So probably we need to remove some of these numbers. Let's try again. Save. All right, let me just copy this to all of these locations. See if that makes a difference. All right, so there we have it. All right, so once we have saved this location, guys, then we move to next. All right, so know that we are at this particular phase of the practice. It says that enter your organization's assets, right? So for persons who are familiar with taking risk assessments, cybersecurity risk assessments within the organization, then your business assets are those critical elements that you want to assess as it relates to risks that can affect those assets that can actually um, affect the organization or the business in of itself. So You want to take all of the medical assets, all of the assets in the organization that forms the are part of the processes that help to go help to keep that organization running. So you want to look at all of those assets, and you can actually export that asset list, or you want to add these assets individually, right? You can even download your an asset template, right? So this is, for example, in this case, let me go to, right, downloads. I could say test CSV, right? So this just for example for us to see what this template actually looks like. Download, right? So the it actually is a template for us. So you could actually add the various assets within your organization in this file itself as a bulk upload, right? So it gives all the details. So you put in the asset type, asset IDs, the status of the asset, encryption, comments, disposal, all of these things, the location where the asset is stored. Once you populate all of this with the necessary information, then you can actually take this file and upload it to the system itself, right? Or you can also add these assets individually, right? So there you have the various asset types. So let us say we have servers. You can say these are active in use and assign, active in use and assign inactive, storage, dispose inactive, right? Whether these are devices